A normal day always begins with familiar moments. The rush of traffic outside, the faint scent of coffee drifting through the kitchen, the same morning greetings repeated just as they were hundreds of times before. But sometimes, the most ordinary days become the starting point of something no one could ever imagine. That evening, the city was wrapped in the dim glow of streets still wet after the rain. People passed by one another, no one paying attention, each carrying their own private story. And in a world that felt safe, someone disappeared. No trace, no cry for help, not a single final word. The narrator pauses, letting a quiet chill run down the viewer's spine, before asking softly, what could make a person, someone who lived a quiet and decent life, suddenly become the center of a mysterious case? What fear flickered behind those familiar eyes? What can people hide behind the smile you see every single day? That night, the neighborhood lights were still glowing, but within that light, another kind of darkness began to spread. A darkness no one could see, a darkness no one could touch, but it crept into every police question, every whisper of confused neighbors, every hollow stare from the family. And right now, we stand at the very first step of this journey. A journey not only to uncover the truth, but to explore the hidden corners of the human soul. Because sometimes, the most frightening thing is not what happened, but why it happened. A normal day ended in darkness, and everything begins here. Before her name became the center of a tangled and heartbreaking case, her life was as ordinary as anyone else's. A kind of ordinary that carried the quiet charm of peaceful American neighborhoods. Rows of light-colored wooden houses, mornings that smelled faintly of warm pastries, evenings filled with laughter drifting over white picket fences. She lived in a small house with a front porch covered in blooming geraniums. Every morning, long before the sunlight reached the edge of the grass, she was already awake. She loved the stillness, the moment when the city was still half asleep. She brewed her usual cup of tea, turned on her favorite playlist, and started the day with a few minutes on the balcony, watching the first streaks of dawn stretch across the road in front of her home. She worked at a small bookstore outside the city center, a place she always called her second home. People often said she had a gift for remembering nearly every regular customer. She remembered the book they bought last week. She remembered the stories they shared while browsing the shelves. Once, an elderly man returned just to tell her that her smile that day made life feel a little easier. She carried a simple dream. One day, she hoped to write her own book, a book about the small, beautiful details of everyday life. She often said that a person doesn't need to do anything grand. Leaving a little warmth in the world is more than enough. To her family, she was the emotional one, the person who never missed a Sunday dinner no matter how busy she was. She often sat close to her mother, sharing stories about an amusing customer or a child who dropped an entire stack of comic books but still smiled brightly. Her stories always carried a gentle light, the light of someone who truly appreciated life. Her friends said she was the kind of person everyone wanted to keep close, not because she stood out, but because she listened. In a world where everyone wants to speak, she made others feel seen, heard, and understood. Sometimes, just sitting next to her in silence was enough to make the day feel lighter. And that is what made her disappearance so painfully unsettling. Her life was not just a name in a police report, not just a brief headline in the local paper. She was someone many people cared for, a small but precious part of everyday moments. Someone who left a mark in those seemingly insignificant interactions that can change an entire day for someone. When she vanished, more than a life was taken away. It was every sunny morning she would have lived, every unfinished story she would have told, every smile that once felt like the softest light in someone's day. And in that silence she left behind, the little community she belonged to felt something unmistakable, something no one wanted to admit. When a good person disappears, the world grows just a little darker. The last time anyone saw her was on a chilly afternoon. It wasn't raining, yet the air felt coated in a thin, gray mist. People in the neighborhood would later say there was something strange about that day. Not the cold, not the wind, but a silence so unusual it felt as if the entire city was holding its breath. A security camera at the corner of the street captured her at nearly 6 in the evening. She walked slowly along the sidewalk, holding a small paper bag from the bookstore. The streetlights had just begun to glow, casting a soft golden hue across her figure. In that footage, she wasn't rushing. She wasn't anxious. She was simply walking home, exactly the way she did every other day. But that very sense of normalcy made the moment feel suffocating, because no one knew those were the final seconds she would ever be seen alive. When the frame was enlarged, her eyes became clear, a distant gaze, as though she was thinking of something gentle. No worry, no suspicion, no sign that just minutes later, everything would change. The camera caught her brushing her hair back into place after a small gust of wind. A gesture so ordinary, so quiet. Yet it later became the detail that brought tears to people who watched it again. She crossed the familiar street, the one filled with children every morning. But that evening, it was empty. Only a wash of yellow light stretched across the damp pavement. No one walked behind her. No one walked ahead. But nearby, a car was parked longer than usual. Its headlights remained off for several seconds. A tiny detail, yet heavy enough to thicken the air. She paused in front of a closed store. She took out her phone. The glow from the screen lit up part of her face. In that moment, she smiled. A soft smile, as if replying to a familiar message. Someone important, something comforting. If anyone had known what would happen next, they might have run to her. They might have told her to take another route home, to be careful, to stay where people could see her. But life doesn't offer rewinds. And on the next camera down the street, she never appeared again. She stepped into a shadow and never came back out. No scream, no struggle. Everything slipped by in silence, so absolute it chilled the soul. And it was that silence that made her final recorded moments so haunting. A moment that, every time it's replayed, leaves everyone asking the same question. If everything seemed so normal, what was waiting for her at the end of that road? The next morning, when the sun had only managed to pull a thin line of light across the sky, her mother already felt something was wrong. Normally, she would send a short message, just a simple good morning, or a quick question about weekend dinner plans. But that day, the phone stayed silent, a heavy kind of silence that made her mother freeze in place for a moment in the familiar kitchen. She called her daughter once, no answer. She called a second time. Still nothing, just the ringtone echoing into emptiness. By the third call, her voice began to tremble. The mother set the phone down, took a deep breath, and tried to steady herself. But the sense of unease only grew stronger. When her husband heard what happened, he stood silent for a few seconds, then grabbed his coat and said he would go to their daughter's house immediately. No one in the family understood why they were so frightened already. But sometimes, the instincts of those who love you are sharper than any warning. When they arrived at her house, the door was still closed. No signs of forced entry. Nothing unusual. Yet it was precisely that normalcy that made everything even more terrifying. Her father called her name. His voice echoed across the quiet front yard. No response. Only the faint sound of wind brushing against the flower pots on the porch. One of her close friends, after noticing she hadn't shown up for work, called to ask. The manager of the bookstore replied with a worried tone. She hadn't arrived. She hadn't messaged. She hadn't called in. And that had never happened before. When her friends gathered in front of her house, none of them wanted to believe something bad had occurred. They stood in a small circle, exchanging anxious glances. One friend whispered, "This isn't like her at all." Another answered, voice tightening, "She would never disappear like this. Never." A male friend tried to reassure everyone, though his voice shook as well. Maybe she stopped by to see someone. Maybe she forgot her phone. Let's not jump to conclusions. But fear was already visible in his eyes. The family contacted the police. At first, it was treated like a routine missing person report. But when officers learned about her personality, how she always texted her mother once she got home, how she had never missed a shift without notice, they began to understand that this wasn't a simple case. Her mother sat on the front steps, clutching her phone as if it were the last thread of hope she could hold. She told herself her daughter was just stuck somewhere. Just forgot her charger. Just had car trouble. But with every passing minute, that hope grew smaller. A neighbor walked over, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, and said softly, "She's a good girl. She'll be okay." But beneath those words, everyone could hear the faint quiver of fear. The police reviewed the security cameras around the neighborhood. The family stood behind them, frozen as each frame moved forward. When the final image of her appeared on screen, her mother broke down. Not because there was anything horrific in the footage, but because she looked so peaceful, so familiar, so much like any other normal day. And that was what made it hurt the most. Her father spoke quietly, almost to himself. She would never just vanish. There's no reason she'd do that. And from that moment on, the entire family understood one thing. A shadow had entered their lives. A shadow they didn't know the length of, or where it would eventually lead them. The investigation began early the next morning, when the first sunlight was still thin and the town's air felt colder than usual. Local officers arrived at the family's home with a serious demeanor, yet everyone could sense the quiet tension clinging to each breath. This wasn't a typical missing person case. The family's reactions, the passage of time, the strange heaviness in the air, everything created an indescribable unease. Her mother handed the police her daughter's phone, where the last messages had stopped late the previous night. Nothing alarming was written there, but it was precisely that silence that chilled everyone. A close friend told investigators that she had spoken to the missing girl that evening, and the girl said she was heading home. But after that, all signals vanished. No texts, no calls, no signs of distress. Just a long, expanding void. Security cameras around the neighborhood were reviewed over and over. One blurry recording surfaced. A lone figure walking quickly down an empty street. Same build, same posture. It could have been her. But the footage was too poor, the streetlights too dim, the night fog too thick. Investigators tried to enhance every frame. But the closer they looked, the more they realized that the video could prove nothing. It might have been her. It might have been someone else entirely. That uncertainty put the entire investigation on edge. Then came a witness statement. A middle-aged man claimed he had seen a dark-colored car parked near the area where she was believed to have gone missing. He vaguely remembered two people standing outside the vehicle, speaking in quick, hushed voices. But when the police questioned him further, his recollection grew less reliable. He couldn't confidently identify the car's color. He wasn't sure if the people he saw were men or women. And he couldn't guarantee the event even took place at the right time. Everything was made of loose fragments, memories softened and distorted by night and time. Early reports revealed contradictions. Some people said they saw her leave the area looking perfectly normal. Others insisted they sensed something off about her that evening. The conflicting statements made the situation even more confusing. Investigators had to revisit each location, re-interview witnesses, and verify every timestamp from the surveillance cameras. But no matter how hard they worked, all they found were faint trails leading into darkness. Every clue they gathered shared the same frustrating shape: uncertainty. No solid evidence. No reliable direction. As the investigation entered its second day, a terrifying truth began to surface. The girl had vanished as if swallowed by the air itself, leaving behind a panicked family, a bewildered community, and an investigative team trapped in a maze of unanswered questions. By the third day of the investigation, the police began focusing on the people who might have crossed paths with the missing girl during that critical window of time. Every conversation was recorded. Every facial expression was scrutinized. Because in mysterious disappearances, the truth often hides in the smallest things. Averted eyes, a mismatched detail, a pause that lasts just a little too long when answering a simple question. The first suspect was the neighbor living directly across from her home. He was the last person to hear her door close that night. When questioned, he sat upright, but his hands kept tightening around each other, as if he was desperately trying to keep something from slipping out of his grasp. He claimed he went to bed early, but what didn't make sense was that the light in front of his house stayed on until nearly dawn. When officers asked why he left it on for so long, his answers were evasive. At first he said he forgot. Then he said he wanted the yard lit for his cats. His shifting explanations were enough to put him on the watch list. The best friend was questioned next. She arrived, with a pale, exhausted face, her eyes swollen from a night of little sleep. She answered with honesty and pain. Yet investigators still had to dissect every detail, because sometimes closeness hides the very things no one expects. When asked about their last conversation, she recounted it clearly. But there were moments when she stared at the floor longer than normal. A behavioral analyst noted that she was suppressing a strong emotion, fear, guilt, or something else. No one knew for sure, but her testimony contained a time gap she couldn't fully explain. Then came the ex-boyfriend. He appeared strangely calm, as if the disappearance had barely touched him. He sat comfortably, eyes forward, blinking less than usual. When asked where he was that evening, he answered so quickly that the officers sensed his response had been rehearsed. One officer noted that his voice didn't waver, but the muscles in his jaw tightened. That tension suggested he was forcing composure or forcing distance. His alibi wasn't wrong, but it was too perfect, too neat, and because of that, deeply suspicious. The last person questioned was the convenience store clerk, who was believed to be the last to see her. He said she came in, bought a few small items, and left immediately. But when detectives reviewed the store's footage, they saw she stayed in the aisle several minutes longer than he claimed. When confronted, he said he must have misremembered because of the number of customers that day. Yet his body language told a different story. He shifted positions constantly, avoided eye contact, and swallowed hard several times. These behaviors didn't prove guilt, but they did suggest he was hiding something. Maybe it was unrelated to the case, or maybe it was a missing piece he was afraid to reveal. By the end of the interviews, investigators realized that none of them could be dismissed. Each person carried a shadow, an inconsistency in their timeline, a reaction that didn't align with the situation. And it was precisely these small fractures that made the investigation feel heavier, because the police knew one thing for certain. Among those faces, whether knowingly or not, someone was hiding a truth that could change the entire direction of the case. As the investigation moved a step further, detectives began to realize that what they needed wasn't a major breakthrough, but the right, small detail at the right moment. Because in cases as cryptic as this one, the truth rarely appears under a spotlight. It hides within the thinnest folds of human behavior. A slip of the tongue, an unconscious movement, a clue tucked away in a place no one thinks to look. And then, the first crack appeared. During a second interview with the neighbor across the street, he accidentally mentioned a sound he claimed was hurried footsteps on the concrete. What made the detective stop was simple. He had never been asked about any sound before, yet he described it in vivid detail, as though he had heard it clearly. An officer quietly noted it down. People often reveal what they're trying hardest to hide when they believe they're being cooperative. He became the first person to move a step higher on the suspicion list. But it was the ex-boyfriend who brought an entirely different heaviness into the interrogation room. In his follow-up interview, he was asked again about the night of the disappearance. His previous statement wasn't contradicted outright, but his way of telling it had shifted. He made a small but telling mistake. Initially, he claimed he was home alone the entire evening. Now he said he had gone to the garage to retrieve something, though he couldn't recall the exact time. That single change made the investigators exchange quick glances. Innocent people tend to tell the same story over and over again. Messy, maybe, but consistent. Those hiding something often alter the smallest detail without realizing it. A behavioral analyst behind the one-way mirror noted his eyes struggled to stay steady, and every time he was asked about the recent state of their relationship, he inhaled a little too deeply. These minor reactions couldn't be ignored. They weren't proof of guilt, but they exposed an internal conflict he was trying to suppress. But the most unexpected twist came from the convenience store clerk. At first, he was simply a witness. Then the cameras from a nearby street revealed something he never mentioned. After the girl left the store, a dark-colored car stopped near the back exit, and the silhouette standing beside it had a build strikingly similar to his. When questioned, he insisted he had gone straight home after his shift. But the video timestamp lined up almost exactly with the end of his work hours. The coincidence was too sharp to dismiss. Detectives reopened his testimony, every sentence, every hesitation, every shifting movement he had made during the interview. These small details began forming a red thread the investigators could no longer ignore. The inconsistencies in timelines, the avoidance of overly specific questions, a car appearing at the exact sensitive moment, a witness remembering things he was never asked, and a man whose calm face contradicted every tense signal his body betrayed. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that one of these individuals was hiding something not through grand lies, but through the tiny fractures in their psychology, exposed only when the light hit at just the right angle. And in that moment, the investigation entered a new phase. A leading suspect began to emerge, not because the police chose him, but because the smallest pieces were finally arranging themselves into a shape everyone recognized. As the new clues threatened to overturn the entire investigation, the detectives began to understand they were dealing with something far more complex. A case is never shaped by actions alone. It is born from silent emotions, built upon layers of disappointment, and carved by the unseen cracks in people's lives. In that darkness, human motives stop being clearly good or bad. They become an intersection of loneliness, pressure, and moments of lost control. They started digging deeper into the lives of everyone involved, and that was when the hidden corners began to reveal themselves. The man whose fingerprints surfaced unexpectedly carried a past filled with unresolved pain. He once had a family, but his marriage had fallen apart years ago. His only daughter grew distant over time. The long silence between them carved a hollow space inside his heart. People who knew him said he buried himself in work, as if staying busy would spare him from confronting that emptiness. And sometimes, when someone is desperately searching for a sense of connection, they cling to fleeting moments with strangers more than they realize. Was he simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? Could emotional instability have pushed him toward an unpredictable reaction? The investigators still had no clear answers, but they could feel the loneliness woven through every detail of his life. The convenience store employee carried a different kind of shadow. He had gone through a severe financial downturn after a failed loan. Bills piled up, pressure forced him to work extra shifts, sometimes surviving on only a few hours of sleep. Coworkers said he looked exhausted, his eyes always heavy with worry. A person under that kind of strain can slip into emotional blind spots where logic and feeling stop aligning. He insisted he had no connection to the girl. But when police dug deeper into old messages, they found a few casual greetings. Nothing inappropriate, nothing excessive, but enough to show he had once noticed her. In a world where people can drown under financial stress, even the smallest spark of emotion can become a point of rupture. The elderly neighbor, whose inconsistent testimony had raised suspicions, carried yet another type of motive. Age and isolation had turned him into someone who watched the world from his window out of habit. It was his way of feeling connected to the neighborhood, to life. And sometimes he envied the young, those with open futures, people free from the fears of aging and loneliness. That didn't make him a bad person, but it did allow for the possibility that he had seen more than he admitted or interpreted what he saw through the haze of his own fragile emotions. And then there was the victim's best friend, the one who always appeared strong on the outside but was secretly battling the pressure to succeed. Everyone around her seemed to be moving forward while she remained stuck between unfinished choices. Maybe she felt she was slowly losing her closest friend. Maybe she feared being left behind. Feelings like that, when kept hidden, can turn into a nameless ache. Detectives had to ask themselves, could jealousy ever erupt into action? Could a fracture in a friendship twist into a split-second burst of anger? As the investigation team pieced together these lives, the suspects stopped being names on paper. They became human beings, people struggling with money, people losing their families, people craving affection, people carrying years of loneliness. And that is what made this case so unpredictable. Because sometimes, a motive doesn't grow from malice. It grows from the small storms inside a person, storms no one else sees. storms that ignite only when life pushes them into a corner. The detectives knew that to uncover the truth, they needed to answer the most important question. Not just who did it, but why someone crossed a line they themselves were once afraid to even look at. The investigation, which had seemed to be heading in the right direction, was suddenly slammed to a halt by a new piece of evidence, a tiny fragment, yet powerful enough to shake the entire foundation of the initial theory. The room fell into absolute silence. The only sound was the cold breeze from the air conditioner, slicing through the tension and brushing down the spines of every investigator present. A security camera recording had just been found, taken from a house only a few blocks away from the crime scene. The owner had been traveling, and no one assumed their camera system was still active. But when the footage began to play, every eye locked onto the screen. And there it was, proof that the person police believed to be their strongest suspect had not been at the location he claimed to have passed through. The realization carved a sudden void in the confidence everyone had placed in his earlier testimony. Then came the fingerprint. A small piece of physical evidence that had seemed useless for days suddenly became significant when the lab updated its findings. The print did not match the person the police had been circling around. It belonged to someone else, someone whose name had never once been mentioned during the entire investigation. The room seemed to freeze for a heartbeat. Every theory, every assumption, every conviction evaporated in an instant. And finally, the witness, the one whose testimony had been the pillar of the investigation's direction, returned, asking to correct what they had said earlier. Their voice trembled. Their eyes remained fixed on the floor, avoiding everyone in the room. They admitted that their original statement had been distorted by fear of being dragged into the case, fear of becoming a suspect themselves. With that confession, the most crucial testimony collapsed into a warped, unreliable fragment. In that moment, it felt as though the entire story had flipped to a new chapter. A wave of disorientation swept through the investigation team. Even the viewers, following this journey, would feel like they were suddenly standing at a fork in the road, where everything that once seemed clear now dissolved into uncertainty. New questions emerged. If the initial suspect wasn't involved, then who was truly hiding in the shadows? And how could their trace appear at the crime scene without leaving a single clear sign of their presence? This first twist didn't just create shock. It opened a quiet, gnawing unease. A sense that someone far more meticulous, patient, and dangerous was watching every step of the investigation. From behind a curtain of silence, the investigators began re-examining every area around the scene, and that was when new characters started to surface. There was a strange man residents had mentioned repeatedly. He wasn't a neighbor, and he wasn't someone they recognized, yet he had a habit of appearing at very unusual hours. People recalled seeing him standing in a dim corner near the park, holding an old canvas bag, his gaze drifting into the distance as if watching someone, or waiting for something to happen. Then there was the street vendor at the end of the block. She remembered a dark SUV parked at the corner for more than an hour on the night before the incident. An odd parked car wasn't unusual in this town, but the way the driver sat motionless inside the unlit vehicle, never stepping out, never turning on a light, never opening the door. It sent chills down her spine every time she retold it. There were also softer voices from longtime residents, people who normally avoided trouble but opened up when investigators knocked on their doors. One elderly man said he had heard someone arguing in low voices around the time the victim was last seen. The words were unclear, but the tone carried an unmistakable tension, like two people who knew each other well, caught in a moment of emotional strain. These bits of information came from ordinary people, neighbors who simply wanted to protect the street they had lived on their whole lives. Their voices carried concern, sympathy, and a quiet fear that darkness was creeping into a place that used to feel safe. The investigators understood this. They wrote down every detail carefully, aware that sometimes the smallest fragments from a community can form the first true outline of the truth. But the more they expanded the investigation, the clearer it became that this case was anything but simple. It was no longer the story of a victim and a single suspect. It might instead be the story of an entire network of people connected in ways they didn't even realize, each one unknowingly standing inside a web of hidden ties. These new faces brought hope, but they also introduced a growing sense of unease. The person behind it all could still be moving silently somewhere just outside their line of sight. And from this point on, the investigation entered a new phase, one where every step forward might bring them closer to the truth, or drag them deeper into a maze of secrets still waiting in the dark. As the investigation expanded to the point where boundaries no longer existed, the investigators realized it was time to confront the one place everyone had quietly avoided: the past of the victim and those connected to her. Because sometimes the truth isn't at the crime scene, it's hidden in what people have spent years trying to bury. So, they began turning over every page of old records, every archived message, every story that friends and family hadn't dared to reveal at the start. The victim, known by everyone as gentle, hard-working, and responsible, suddenly appeared more layered than the simple portrait people had built in their minds. Her life wasn't as peaceful as it seemed. There were things she kept to herself, like a closed door, not to protect her own vulnerability, but to shield the people she cared about. A close friend confessed that she had once gone through a severe period of work-related stress. The pressure became so heavy, she lost sleep for many nights. But she didn't want anyone to worry, so she simply said she was fine. The friend's voice trembled as she repeated that phrase, because now, it sounded like a warning sign they had all overlooked. Her family recalled that she had a complicated relationship with an old friend. They no longer spoke, yet lingering emotions remained like wounds that had never fully healed. Small tensions, quiet disagreements, unspoken resentments, all of these had slowly carved a distance no one could clearly explain. And then came the matter of money. Not large debts, but enough to stir concern. A small account withdrawn multiple times, unexplained expenses, transactions no one could confidently identify. When questioned, her relatives could only shake their heads. They didn't believe she was in trouble, but the silence behind her eyes, seen again through the lens of hindsight, became a source of quiet regret. Investigators continued mapping the people who had crossed paths with her life. A coworker, with whom she had a simmering conflict. An old acquaintance who had borrowed money and disappeared. A neighbor who remembered seeing her standing alone on the balcony late at night, staring into the dim street as if wrestling with something no one could help her untangle. Every newly uncovered story made the picture deeper, more layered. And those layers didn't just reveal the victim, they revealed humanity itself. The silent sadness people carry, the worries they hide, the burdens they swallow alone because they fear becoming a weight on someone else. Revisiting the past wasn't just about finding clues. It was an emotional journey, one that reminded the investigators that behind every person lies a universe of untold stories, even ones hidden from those closest to them. And sometimes, those buried truths hold the key to understanding what truly happened. As the team closed the final file of the day, they realized this case wasn't simply a disappearance. It was an entire life filled with fragility, scars, and secrets time had failed to erase. And at that moment, a chilling clarity settled in. The truth was getting closer, but it was also becoming more dangerous than ever. It was a gray afternoon, the clouds hanging low, and the wind carrying a strange, cold bite. A middle-aged woman walked into the police station. Her steps were slow, slightly trembling, as if every movement was a battle against her own fear. Her face carried the exhaustion of many sleepless nights, yet her eyes revealed something pushing her forward, a kind of determination mixed with dread. She said she needed to speak with the lead investigator on the case. Nobody knew who she was. Nobody could guess why she appeared at this moment. But the moment she opened her mouth, the atmosphere in the small room grew heavy. She had seen something on the night the victim disappeared. Her voice quivered, but every word fell like stones, disturbing a still lake. She explained that she lived in an apartment near the street where the victim was last seen. For months, she had been afraid to walk through that area at night. Not because of the darkness, but because of something else. Something she had never dared to speak about. That night, she had seen a figure standing near the victim. The way they interacted didn't look like a casual conversation. There was no warmth, no friendliness, no laughter. Only a sense of tension, tight, compressed, unsettling. The victim stepped back. The other person stepped forward. Everything happened quickly, but enough to send a cold shiver through her. She had wanted to call the police right then, but fear pulled her back. a deeply human fear. Fear of becoming involved. Fear of retaliation. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of becoming the center of a story she wanted no part of. So she stayed silent. She told herself maybe she had misunderstood. Maybe it wasn't as serious as it seemed. But when news of the victim's disappearance broke, her silence became a weight, crushing her more each day. Every night, she asked herself, if I had spoken up then, would things be different now? Eventually, she couldn't bear it anymore. Her silence had become a wound. And today, she stepped out of the darkness she had built around herself. The investigator looked at her for a long moment. There was no blame, no irritation, only understanding. Because investigators know, sometimes fear is the strongest prison a person can be trapped in. When the witness described the man, she saw the face, the posture, the way he moved, the entire direction of the investigation shifted instantly. The case no longer revolved around the familiar suspects. A new shadow had entered the story, one no one had ever mentioned before. And in that moment, the investigative team understood. They had just touched another layer of the truth, a layer deeper, darker, and far more dangerous than anything before. The interrogation room was small, the walls gray, the white light above, striking the metal table and forming a harsh, blinding pool of brightness. Everything in this room was cold. Cold enough that time itself seemed frozen, waiting to witness this moment. The door opened. The man stepped inside. Not hurried, not trembling. But the calmness he once carried was no longer there. His eyes flickered for a second when he saw the investigator, then quickly regained their rigid composure. A type of restraint held too tightly, the kind that makes people watch closely. The investigator pulled out a chair and sat across from him, just close enough that each could hear the other breathe. No one spoke. The room thickened with silence, like an invisible rope tightening slowly from both ends. The investigator opened a laptop. The screen lit up, illuminating the suspect's face, a face beginning to lose color. Images he could not deny. New camera footage, location data, the missing 2 minutes, and the witness's testimony, the one who finally stepped out of the shadows. The investigator didn't give a speech, just one sentence, soft enough to feel like a push against the wall the suspect had spent weeks building. Explain. The man clenched his fists. His shoulders trembled slightly. No one could tell if it was fear or anger. He glanced at the screen, then at the table. A deep breath escaped him. Then he leaned back, his eyes revealing something unmistakably human for the first time. Exhaustion carved from days of hiding. I never meant to hurt her. The sentence fell lightly onto the metal table, but it weighed as heavily as stone. Not a full confession. Not a denial. Suspended somewhere between truth and despair. The investigator pressed on, his voice low but sharp, slicing through the suspect's remaining defenses. Then why were you there? Why did you approach her at that exact moment? Why did you lie about those 2 missing minutes? Silence returned, thicker, tighter, as if the room didn't have enough air for both men to breathe at once. Then slowly, the suspect lifted his head. His face shifted, no more feigned calm, no more armor of indifference. Only fear, and something that resembled regret, twisted by a secret he had held far too long. He spoke, his voice low and rough, every word dragged from a weight pressing deep on his chest. I was there because I needed to see her. I had been waiting for weeks, but I didn't think it would turn out like this. I panicked. I didn't know what to do. The investigator leaned forward, his gaze sharp but not hostile. A gaze trying to pull the truth into the open by reaching the last fragment of humanity left inside the suspect. What were you afraid of? The question made the man blink. A drop of sweat hit the table. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, as if the confession was burning inside his throat, but still being swallowed by a fear he couldn't face. He didn't scream. He didn't collapse. He just sat there, staring into nothing, like someone listening to the sound of his own world breaking apart. And the investigator understood. The most critical moment had arrived. A guilty person never confesses immediately, But their body does. Their eyes do. The silence between their sentences does. The truth was cracking open, and it would only take one more breath for it to shatter completely. When the final confession was recorded, the room seemed to sink into silence. No more footsteps echoing from the officers, no more clicking sounds from the camera. Only the heavy breathing of the perpetrator remained, along with the tense stares of those who had spent weeks trying to uncover the truth. The investigators began reconstructing every minute of the incident, like rewinding a slow-motion film. Everything was based on the testimony, the physical traces at the scene, and the psychological analyses they had painstakingly pieced together over time. On the night of the incident, the suspect had been in a state of emotional collapse. A psychologist explained that his mental state was like a glass filled to the brim, only one last drop was needed for everything to spill over. Before that night, he had been carrying layers of pressure and pain that he never expressed to anyone. No one realized that behind his calm appearance was a mind constantly on the verge of exploding. When the victim appeared at that moment, everything happened too quickly. It wasn't hesitation. It was years of suppressed anger erupting instantly at a seemingly harmless comment. The expert said this type of reaction is common among people who fear failure, who carry deep insecurities. A single moment of losing control destroyed 2 lives. One person lost their life, and the other lost himself. Based on the confession and on-site verification, the investigative team reconstructed the suspect's path. Every movement, every direction he turned, every attempt he made to hide what he had done. And throughout that process, one detail left everyone stunned. He returned to the crime scene at dawn, just to make sure no one had discovered anything. When the timeline was projected onto the screen, every final detail clicked into place. The investigators sat in silence, not because of surprise, but because they could feel the deep human story behind the crime, the emotional fragments, fear, loneliness, and social pressure all converging into a tragic ending. And when the psychologist concluded that, if someone had listened to him earlier, if there had been an honest conversation, perhaps that night would never have happened. The entire room fell into a heavy silence. A silence that makes the audience swallow hard, forcing them to think about the things we often overlook in everyday life. This was not just the final truth of the case. It was the truth about human beings, about the wounds no one sees, and the price that silence demands. When the final truth was revealed, the victim's family didn't break down. No one screamed. No one collapsed. They just stood still like people who had run out of tears long ago, left only with a cold, hollow space inside their hearts. The victim's mother clutched a small handkerchief. She once hoped that the truth, no matter how painful, would bring her some peace. But after hearing the full reconstruction, after learning that her child died in the moment of someone else's despair, she whispered that no truth could ever return a breath, and no confession could ever fill the empty seat at the dinner table where her child used to sit. The father reacted differently. He tried to stay composed, standing tall like the pillar of the family he believed he needed to be. But the slight trembling of his shoulders betrayed him. In American culture, many fathers do not easily express emotion. They often choose silence, and so did he. But this silence carried weight, the weight of loss, of unanswered questions he would carry for the rest of his life. The victim's younger sister broke down when the police presented the final timeline. To her, her brother wasn't just family. He was a friend, a protector, a piece of her childhood. She said the thing that hurt her most wasn't how he died, but that he left without getting the chance to say goodbye. The entire family stood before the media after the briefing. Harsh camera lights, rapid-fire questions. But they didn't speak about the crime. They spoke about the person they lost, his gentle smile, his breakfast habits, the plans he never got to finish. They wanted the world to remember him as someone who had dreams and joys, not just a name tied to a tragedy. And when the briefing ended, the mother said something that left everyone silent. Justice may be served. The truth may come to light. But the pain of a mother, the loss of a family that will remain forever. There is no courtroom verdict that can close that wound. In that moment, the audience didn't just see a grieving family. They saw themselves. They recognized something familiar, simple, painfully human. Something anyone who has ever loved can understand. That loss always leaves a void that can never be filled. And the truth, no matter how important, can never bring someone back. Conclusion. Lessons and warnings for the community, asterisk, asterisk. When the case finally closes, what remains is not just the relief of justice being served. What remains are the questions each of us must confront. In a community that seems peaceful on the surface, just one moment of carelessness, one misplaced trust, one small signal ignored, can lead to a loss that can never be undone. This story reminds us that safety is not only found in locked doors or well-lit streets. Safety lies in our ability to observe, to listen, to sense when something feels off. Many people believe tragedy only happens somewhere far away, to someone they have never met. But the truth is, sometimes it happens right next to us, on the very street we walk every day. In American culture, there is a saying, "It takes a village." A strong community is one where people look out for each other, where they ask questions when something seems wrong, where they speak up when someone needs help. Apathy is the most dangerous gap of all. Silence is what allows darkness to grow. This story is also a reminder about trust. Not everyone who smiles at us is a good person, but not every stranger is someone to fear. The important thing is staying aware, looking deeper into behaviors, relationships, and the small signs we often overlook because we assume everything will be fine. And ultimately, this is a message about humanity. When we face loss, we finally understand how fragile life truly is. Every hug, every check-in, every shared meal carries more weight than we realize. Do not wait until someone is gone to wonder whether you love them enough. The case may be closed, the cameras may stop rolling, but the lesson remains. A gentle yet powerful reminder that protecting one another is not a responsibility. It is the only way to preserve peace in an unpredictable world. And if there is one thing to carry with us after this story, it is awareness, care, and appreciation for the people we love. Because sometimes, if we pay just a little more attention, tragedy might never happen.